Y'all, let me tell you about Margaret Thompson, a woman whose story's gonna make your heart ache and then soar like an eagle. Now, picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in small-town Nebraska, and Margaret's sorting through her mail like any other day. Bills, catalogs, the usual stuff. But then she sees it. This fancy cream-colored envelope with her name written in gold letters so pretty they could have been done by angels themselves. Her hands start trembling as she opens it up, and honey, what she reads inside nearly knocks her clean off her feet. It's a wedding invitation from Robert, her ex-husband of 15 years. The same man who walked out on her, calling her worthless, saying she'd never amount to nothing. The same man who blamed her month after month for not giving him children, making her feel smaller than a bug under his shoe. "You gotta be kidding me," she whispers to herself, staring at the invitation like it might bite her. But here's the thing. Robert ain't inviting her out of kindness. Oh no, sugar. He wants to parade her in front of all their old friends and neighbors, show them the broken woman he left behind. He figures she'll show up looking defeated, maybe even desperate, proving to everyone that he made the right choice walking away. What Robert don't know, what he can't even imagine, is that Margaret ain't the same woman he left crying on her kitchen floor all those years ago. Time has a funny way of healing wounds and building strength, and boy, has Margaret grown strong. As she sets that invitation down on her coffee table, a slow smile spreads across her face. She's gonna go to that wedding all right, but not for the reasons Robert thinks. And what happens next? Well, let's just say Robert's about to learn that sometimes the woman you underestimate turns out to be the one who'll teach you the biggest lesson of your life. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's continue this exciting story. Now, honey, let me take you back to when Margaret's world started crumbling. You see, her marriage to Robert didn't start out rotten. It just turned that way, like milk left too long in the sun. For the first couple years, things were decent enough. But then came the pressure, the expectations, and oh Lord, the blame. Every month that passed without good news, Robert's face would get a little darker, his words a little sharper. "What's wrong with you, Margaret?" he'd say, pacing around their little kitchen like a caged animal. "Every other woman in this town can have babies, but not you. Maybe there's something broken inside you." Those words hit Margaret like hammers on glass, breaking something new inside her heart each time. She'd sit in that same kitchen after he left for work, staring at her coffee getting cold, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe she was the problem. Maybe she wasn't woman enough, wasn't good enough. The worst part? The way Robert would look at her when they'd see other families at church service or around town. His eyes would fill with this cold disappointment, like she'd personally failed him in the worst possible way. "Look at them," he'd whisper harshly, nodding toward couples with their children. "That could have been us if you weren't so incomplete." Night after night, Margaret would cry into her pillow, praying to God for an answer, for healing, for anything that might make her husband look at her with love again instead of that terrible contempt. She tried everything: doctors, specialists, treatments that made her sick and drained their savings. Nothing worked. And Robert? He grew meaner with each passing month, his patience thinner than paper. The man who once brought her flowers now barely spoke to her, except to point out her failures. But what Margaret didn't know then, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that all this pain was preparing her for something bigger. Sometimes, sugar, we gotta break completely before we can rebuild ourselves stronger than ever. Well, sugar, after 7 long years of that torture, Margaret finally reached her breaking point. It was a cold February morning when Robert packed his bags and walked out that front door, leaving nothing but cruel words echoing in the empty house. "Find yourself someone who can put up with your failures," he said, not even looking back. "I'm done wasting my life on damaged goods." Margaret stood there in her nightgown, watching through the kitchen window as his truck disappeared down Maple Street. The house felt bigger than a cathedral and twice as empty. For 3 days straight, she didn't eat nothing but crackers and water, couldn't even bring herself to shower. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her chest like she was drowning in her own sorrow. But you know what they say, when you hit rock bottom, the only way left is up. On that 4th day, Margaret looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw something that scared her more than Robert's anger ever did. She saw a ghost of the woman she used to be. That's when she made herself a promise. "Margaret Thompson, you're gonna survive this. You're gonna stand on your own 2 feet. And boy, did she try. Started working double shifts at Miller's Diner, serving coffee and pie to folks who looked at her with pity in their eyes. Her hands got rough from washing dishes. Her feet ached something fierce, but every dollar she earned felt like a tiny victory. She was learning that she could take care of herself, even if it meant eating beans and rice most nights. Then one evening in late spring, a new customer walked into the diner. His name was David Martinez, a soft-spoken carpenter with kind eyes and calloused hands. While other folks whispered about poor Margaret and her divorce, David just smiled and asked how her day was going. "You got a beautiful smile," he said one night as she refilled his coffee. "Don't let nobody tell you different." For the first time in years, Margaret felt her heart skip a beat for all the right reasons. "Now, honey, let me tell you how David Martinez became the blessing Margaret never knew she needed." This man didn't just see past her scars, he helped her heal them with the gentlest touch you ever did see. Every evening after her shift, he'd walk her home, carrying her tired spirit with his quiet strength and genuine laughter. "Margaret," he'd say, sitting on her front porch swing, "you got more goodness in your pinky finger than most folks got in their whole body. Don't you ever forget that." And slowly, oh so slowly, she started believing him. David didn't push or rush nothing, he just loved her steady and true, like morning coffee and Sunday sunshine. 6 months later, they got married in a simple ceremony at Grace Community Church. Margaret wore a pale blue dress that made her eyes sparkle, and David couldn't stop grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. For the first time in forever, Margaret felt like she was exactly where God intended her to be. But then came the news that nearly knocked both of them sideways. Margaret had been feeling poorly, tired, queasy, emotional as a thunderstorm. When she finally went to see Dr. Patterson, expecting maybe the flu, she got the shock of her lifetime instead. "Well, Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Patterson said with a smile wider than Texas, "looks like you're going to be real busy come spring. You're carrying triplets." Margaret just stared at him, mouth hanging open like a barn door in a windstorm. "Doc, you sure about that? 3 babies? All at once?" "3 heartbeats clear as church bells on Sunday morning," he confirmed, pointing at the ultrasound screen where 3 tiny miracles were growing inside her. Y'all, when Margaret got home and told David, that man picked her up and spun her around their little kitchen until they were both dizzy with joy and wonder. But late that night, when David was sleeping peaceful beside her, Margaret lay awake with her hand on her belly, tears streaming down her face. These weren't tears of sadness, sugar. These were tears of pure, overwhelming gratitude. After all those years of Robert telling her she was broken, here was God's answer. Not just 1 baby, but 3. 3 little souls choosing her to be their mama. Robert's cruel words had been nothing but lies wrapped in poison, and now she had living proof growing right inside her heart. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for showing me I was never broken at all." Now, sugar, let's jump ahead 3 years to that Tuesday morning when Margaret found that fancy invitation in her mailbox. Those 3 babies, little Emma, Samuel, and Grace, were now walking, talking bundles of pure joy, filling every corner of that house with laughter that used to echo with nothing but loneliness. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line, watching her triplets chase butterflies in the backyard, when David came home from his carpentry job with a troubled look on his weathered face. "Honey," he said, holding that cream-colored envelope, "this came addressed to you, looks important." The moment Margaret saw Robert's name in fancy script, her stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. She'd been Margaret Martinez for 3 beautiful years now, but that invitation was addressed to Margaret Thompson, like he was trying to drag her back to the woman she used to be. "Mama, Mama, look," little Emma called out, toddling over with a dandelion clutched in her tiny fist. Margaret scooped up her daughter, breathing in that sweet smell of sunshine and innocence before opening the envelope with trembling fingers. Y'all, when she read those words inviting her to Robert's wedding, Margaret felt her heart racing like a scared rabbit. But then she looked around at her life, at David building a treehouse for the kids, at Samuel trying to catch soap bubbles, at Grace singing some made-up song about puppies, and something shifted inside her chest. This wasn't about reconciliation or politeness. Oh no, honey. This was Robert's final attempt to hurt her, to parade her before all their old friends as the broken woman he'd been right to leave. In his cruel mind, she'd show up looking defeated, maybe even desperate, proving to everyone that his new bride was the upgrade he deserved. "That man's got some nerve," David said quietly, reading the invitation over her shoulder. His jaw tightened like he was chewing nails, but his voice stayed gentle for the children's sake. Margaret set Emma down and watched all 3 kids playing together, their laughter mixing with the evening breeze. These babies had been born healthy and strong, each one a living testimony to the lies Robert had poisoned her with for years. Every diaper she'd changed, every fever she'd nursed, every bedtime story she'd told, it all proved what she'd suspected deep in her heart. She'd never been the problem. "You know what, David?" Margaret said, a slow smile spreading across her face like sunrise over wheat fields. "I think we're going to accept this invitation." What Robert didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the broken woman he'd left behind no longer existed. "Now, honey, let me tell you about the week leading up to that wedding, because Margaret's preparation wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up as her true self. Every night after putting Emma, Samuel, and Grace to bed, she'd sit at her kitchen table with David, planning not an attack, but a testimony. "Sweetheart," David said one evening, his carpenter's hands gentle on hers, "you don't owe that man nothing. Not your presence, not your time, not even a second thought." But Margaret had prayed long and hard about this decision. "David, I ain't going there to hurt nobody. I'm going there to close a chapter that's been hanging open too long. Those children deserve to see their mama stand tall, not hide in shame from a past that wasn't even her fault." The dress shopping was the hardest part. Standing in front of those mirrors, Margaret kept hearing Robert's cruel voice echoing in her head. "You'll never be beautiful enough, smart enough, woman enough." Her hands shook as she tried on dress after dress, each one feeling like it was exposing every insecurity he'd planted in her soul. Then she found it, a simple navy blue dress that hugged her in all the right places, elegant without being flashy, dignified without being stuffy. When she looked in that mirror, she didn't see Robert's failures anymore. She saw David's wife, Emma's mama, Samuel and Grace's protector. For the children, she picked out the most beautiful yellow outfits, bright as sunshine, impossible to miss. "You babies are gonna shine like little stars," she told them as she brushed their hair. They giggled and squirmed, not understanding the significance but feeling their mama's excitement. The carriage idea came to her during Sunday service when Pastor Williams was talking about how God can turn our mourning into dancing. Margaret had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, but Robert had given her a quick courthouse ceremony with witnesses pulled off the street. Now, watching her children play in their backyard, she realized she could create her own fairy tale moment. "A white carriage?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "Margaret, that's going to cost us near a month's wages." "David Martinez," Margaret said, her voice steady as bedrock, "I spent 7 years believing I wasn't worth celebrating. I ain't making that mistake again." As the wedding day approached, Margaret's nerves started acting up something fierce. What if Robert was right? What if she was just setting herself up for more humiliation? But then little Grace would climb into her lap, or Samuel would show her a drawing, or Emma would give her one of those slobbery 3-year-old kisses, and Margaret would remember. She wasn't going to that wedding as Robert's victim. She was going as God's beloved daughter, surrounded by his greatest gifts to her. Y'all, what happened next was something straight out of a movie, except this was real life, and the emotions were raw as fresh wounds. Margaret's heart was pounding like thunder as their white carriage pulled up to the grand ballroom on Elm Street. Through the windows, she could see all those fancy folks in their expensive clothes, laughing and toasting Robert's new beginning. "You ready for this, sweetheart?" David asked, squeezing her hand. Emma, Samuel, and Grace were bouncing with excitement in their bright yellow outfits, not understanding the weight of this moment, but feeling their mama's nervous energy. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothing down her navy dress. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, then looked at her beautiful family. "All right, babies, let's go show these folks what real happiness looks like." The ballroom doors swung open, just as the wedding party was posing for pictures. Every single head turned toward the entrance, and honey, the silence that followed was deafening. First came little Emma, her pigtails bouncing as she skipped through those doors. Then Samuel and Grace holding hands and giggling at all the fancy decorations. And then came Margaret. She walked in like she owned the place, her head held high, one hand holding Emma's tiny fingers and the other resting on her heart. Behind them, framed in the doorway like a picture, sat that gleaming white carriage with its proud horses stamping their feet. Robert's new bride, a young thing named Jessica who couldn't be more than 25, nearly dropped her champagne glass. Her mouth fell open like she was trying to catch flies. But Robert, Robert went pale as fresh snow, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and something that looked an awful lot like panic. Who are those children?" Jessica whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear. Margaret's old neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, started counting on her fingers. "Well, I'll be. That's Margaret Martinez now. And those babies, honey, They can't be more than 3 years old. Y'all, you could hear a pin drop in that ballroom. Every person there was doing the math, realizing that if Margaret had triplets 3 years old, then everything Robert had told them about her being unable to have children was nothing but cruel lies. Margaret felt every eye in that room on her family, but instead of shame, she felt something she'd never experienced before: pure, unshakable pride. These weren't just her children. They were living proof that God's timing is always perfect, even when we can't see it. Robert started walking toward them, his smile forced and shaky, but Margaret just stood there serene as Sunday morning, watching his carefully constructed story crumble right before his eyes. Sugar, what happened next was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Robert walked toward Margaret with that fake smile plastered on his face, but his eyes were darting around like a cornered animal looking for an escape route. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, and honey, you could practically smell the fear rolling off him. Well, Margaret," Robert said, his voice cracking like thin ice, I didn't expect you to actually come, and with children." His eyes kept flicking down to Emma, Samuel, and Grace, who were busy admiring the fancy chandelier and pointing at the pretty flowers. "Mama! Mama!" little Samuel called out, tugging on Margaret's dress. "Look at all the sparkly lights." "I see them, baby," Margaret said, her voice steady as bedrock. She didn't flinch, didn't look away from Robert's shocked face. "Say hello to Mr. Robert, children. This is an old friend of Mama's." David stepped up beside his wife, his presence solid and protective. "Kids, why don't you go admire those pretty roses over there?" he suggested gently, and the triplets scampered off, their yellow outfits like little rays of sunshine in that suddenly tense room. "Robert," Margaret said simply, extending her hand like a proper lady. "Congratulations on your special day." But Robert couldn't take his eyes off those children. Y'all, the man looked like he'd been struck by lightning. All around them, the wedding guests were whispering behind their hands, their eyes wide with understanding. Mrs. Henderson was practically vibrating with shock, whispering to anyone who'd listen about how Robert had spent years telling folks that Margaret was defective and couldn't give him the family he deserved. Those are your children," Robert stammered, his face going from pale to green around the edges. "Our children," David corrected firmly, his arm sliding protectively around Margaret's waist. "Emma, Samuel, and Grace Martinez, beautiful, healthy, perfect children." Jessica, Robert's young bride, appeared at his elbow, looking confused and hurt. "Robert, honey, what's going on? Who are these people? You said your ex-wife was—" She trailed off, her eyes moving from the children back to Robert's sweating face. Margaret felt a stab of genuine pity for this young woman who was about to discover what kind of man she'd just married. "Jessica, is it?" Margaret said kindly. "You look absolutely beautiful today, sweetheart. I hope your marriage brings you all the happiness you deserve." The kindness in Margaret's voice seemed to cut Robert deeper than any insult could have. Here he was, exposed as a liar in front of everyone he'd tried to impress, and his ex-wife was showing more grace than he'd ever possessed. "Honey, sometimes the most powerful victories happen without a single word being spoken." Margaret didn't need to give some dramatic speech or cause a scene. She just stood there, calm as a summer lake, while her 3 beautiful children played around her feet like living testimonies to the truth. The shift in that ballroom was like watching storm clouds roll in. One by one, the wedding guests started putting the pieces together. Mrs. Peterson, who'd been Robert's neighbor for 20 years, was whispering furiously to her husband, "Harold, those babies can't be more than 3 years old. That means when Robert was telling everyone Margaret was broken, she was already carrying his replacement's children with another man," Harold finished, shaking his head in disgust. Y'all, the gossip spread through that reception faster than wildfire through dry grass. Folks who'd spent years feeling sorry for Robert, the poor man stuck with a defective wife, were now seeing him for what he really was. A man without character who'd destroyed a woman's reputation to cover his own failures. Jessica, bless her heart, was standing there in her fancy white dress, looking like someone had just pulled the rug out from under her whole world. "Robert," she whispered, tugging on his sleeve, "you told me she couldn't have children. You said that's why you divorced her." Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Sweat was beading on his forehead, and his hands were shaking so bad he nearly dropped his champagne glass. "Jessica, I can explain." But what could he explain? How could he tell his new bride that he'd spent 7 years tormenting an innocent woman, making her believe she was broken? when the truth was he'd been too impatient and selfish to wait for God's timing. Little Grace toddled over to Margaret, tugging on her dress. "Mama, why is everyone looking at us?" she asked in that sweet 3-year-old voice that carried across the silent ballroom. Margaret scooped up her daughter, kissing her forehead. "They're just admiring how beautiful you and your brother and sister are, sweetheart." That simple moment, a mother's love, pure and uncomplicated, seemed to highlight everything Robert had thrown away. Here was a woman who'd found real happiness, real love, real family, while he was standing there exposed as someone who'd built his new life on lies and cruelty. David moved closer to his wife, pride radiating from every inch of his being. These weren't just Margaret's children. They were his children too, in every way that mattered. The silence stretched on, until finally Margaret spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Well, Robert, I just wanted to wish you happiness. David, children, I think it's time we headed home." And with that, she turned toward the door, her family surrounding her like a protective shield, leaving Robert to face the consequences of a lifetime of lies. Y'all, the most beautiful part of Margaret's story wasn't what happened in that ballroom. It was what happened when she walked out of it. As that white carriage pulled away from the grand ballroom, Margaret felt something she'd never experienced before, complete and total peace with herself. Emma, Samuel, and Grace were chattering excitedly about the pretty party, completely unaware that they'd just rewritten history simply by existing. David reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You did good in there, sweetheart. Real good." Margaret looked back through the carriage window one last time. Inside that ballroom, Robert was probably scrambling to explain himself to Jessica and all those guests who now saw him for what he truly was. But that wasn't Margaret's concern anymore. She'd carried his cruel words for too many years, let them shape how she saw herself, how she moved through the world. "You know what, David?" Margaret said, watching the Nebraska countryside roll by. "I spent so long thinking I needed Robert to admit he was wrong, to apologize, to somehow take back all those years of pain. But sitting here with you and our babies, I realize something important." "What's that, honey?" "I don't need his apology anymore. I don't need him to validate what I always knew deep down, that I was never broken. These 3 miracles right here are all the proof I'll ever need." Little Samuel had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his little face peaceful and trusting. Grace was playing with David's wedding ring, and Emma was making up songs about horses. This was Margaret's real victory, not the shock on Robert's face or the whispers of the wedding guests, but this moment right here, this family, this love, this peace. 2 weeks later, Margaret heard through Mrs. Henderson that Jessica had moved back in with her parents, unable to handle the revelation that her new husband had spent years psychologically tormenting his first wife. The grand wedding that was supposed to be Robert's triumph had become his public downfall, but Margaret felt no satisfaction in his misery. If anything, she felt sorry for him. Robert would have to live with the knowledge that he'd thrown away something real and beautiful for his own selfish pride. He'd have to face the fact that while he was busy tearing down the woman who loved him, she was out there building a life so full of joy that it made his victories look hollow. That evening, as Margaret tucked her children into their beds and kissed their sleepy faces, she whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for revenge, not for vindication, but for the journey that had brought her here, to this place of wholeness, this family, this love that asked nothing of her but to be herself. Margaret Martinez had finally come home to her own heart. Conclusion: Margaret's story teaches us that sometimes our greatest victories aren't about proving others wrong. They're about proving ourselves right. When life tears us down, when people we love make us feel worthless, when we're told we're not enough, the real triumph comes in refusing to stay broken. Margaret didn't just survive Robert's cruelty, she transformed it into strength, built a beautiful life from the ashes of her pain, and discovered that the woman he called defective was actually perfectly whole. Are there voices from your past still telling you what you can't do, who you can't become? What would happen if you stopped listening to those lies and started believing in your own worth? Margaret waited years to discover her strength. What are you waiting for? Remember to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. There's another incredible story of triumph waiting for you. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching stories that will inspire you to rewrite your own ending.